Revenge of the Sith is the best Star Wars film, or at least it had the potential to be. As things stand, though, it is only the best of the prequels. However, there is a version that arguably lives up to being the culmination of Anakin Skywalker's fall and the end of the saga up to that point, when viewing it in release order, the novelisation. Written by Matthew Stover, the novelisation changes or outright improves a lot of the most significant moments in the film, restores deleted scenes, and adds entirely new ones. For those who had been keeping up with the expanded universe content prior to this, although there were stories set in other eras, such as Knights of the Old Republic, the main long-running storyline was focused around the Clone Wars. Comics, novels, games, the Clone Wars microseries, all of them were building up to Revenge of the Sith, and from that perspective, building up to this version of the story in particular. Yeah, for some reason the film itself was one of the last versions of Revenge of the Sith to release, with this and the game being released over a month and a half before the film, and the first issue of the comic releasing in March. As an equivalent to the opening crawl, the novel's prologue provides a wider context for the perspective of the Clone Wars for regular beings in the galaxy, their perspective on the Battle of Coruscant, and the implications of how these perspectives were influenced by Palpatine to pave the way for the Galactic Empire. Regarding the Separatists in particular, Dooku, the human leader of the Separatists, was presented as still being seen as principled and respective, despite those principles being viewed as mistaken and misplaced, while each of the other Separatist leaders being given traits that are referred to as being shared among their respective species, while Grievous was simply viewed as a monster in-universe. The manipulations of perspectives is also referenced later in a sequence between Palpatine and Dooku, where it is referenced that the Separatists themselves were engineered in a specific way to make it easier to implement the ideas the former would have his empire push, especially its focus on humanity, which was one of the reasons why, aside from Dooku himself, several of the main figures in the Separatist alliance were from other species from an in-universe perspective. Although Dooku's own view regarding how the post-Clone Wars galaxy would look seems to be closer in ways to traditional Sith empires, with Skywalker being intended to be the head enforcer of an army of dark side Force users, presumably similar in level to the Dark Acolytes from the Star Wars comics of the time, while under strict control by the two actual Dark Lords of the Sith due to his reckless nature. Mainly for personal issues with visualization, I don't have much to say about the opening space battle, aside from how it seems to show an extended version of the battle that goes back to before the opening frame of the film. It's not that the scene's adaptation is bad, it's just that space battles have always been the types of sequences I have found most difficult to picture in my mind when reading, especially when it's from the perspective of starfighter pilots instead of on the bridges of capital ships. However, it is also the start of a motif in the novel of giving extended pieces of prose describing what it is like and what it means to be one of the major characters at a specific point in the story, which Anakin naturally gets multiple of over the course of the novel up to the point of becoming Darth Vader, which goes into detail regarding just how bad his life would be until his redemption and in what ways. Throughout the novel, other characters to get these sections include Obi-Wan, obviously, Dooku, and Grievous. Instead of the film's sequences of Anakin and Obi-Wan running through corridors and jumping in and out of elevators as once they land on Grievous's ship, which are some of the parts that I would at least reduce in screen time, if not remove almost entirely to make room for improvements to the film, the novel takes place from Dooku and Palpatine's perspective while waiting for them to arrive, to the point where the novel describes the film's scenes as low-comedy business from Dooku's perspective. Along with that, the sequence directly references something that is only implied in the film. That's the reason why Grievous and the Separatist fleet were still at Coruscant by the time the film started, instead of immediately departing once they had Palpatine, was to draw in Anakin and Obi-Wan, with Grievous himself being kept in the dark about this reason, and directly confronting Dooku over the decision to remain at the planet. Another aspect of the Sith Grand Plan that Grievous was left in the dark about was a pretty significant one. The fact that Palpatine and Sidious were the same person, as referenced through the cyborg's thought process during his escape from the ship later on in the book, by thinking that Sidious would not mind him abandoning the ship while Palpatine and the Jedi were aboard. Initially highlighted in his conversation with Palpatine, the verbal taunts in the opening of the confrontation with Anakin and Obi-Wan portrays how Dooku views both of them. Having a small amount of respect for Obi-Wan due to the link of Qui-Gon between the two masters, and with this respect being enough to want to turn him to the dark side, and at least address him formally through his title of Master, while giving no such courtesy to Anakin. The duel itself has a greater sense of progression in the novel than in the film, either through its being in the prose format or just giving the characters more direction, as the Jedi initially fool Dooku by using lightsaber forms that they have less skill with, and just generally acting sloppy before switching to their preferred forms once he becomes overconfident. At the end of the duel, Dooku's final moments depict an alternative version of the film scene, which was eventually either cut or rewritten to have him actively begging for his life in the pre-scripted way that he had discussed the plan with Palpatine. Fortunately, Dooku's inner monologue at this point of the book is better at portraying his fear and self-importance, having a moment at believing that this had been what his life had built up to. That his only significance in the galaxy and how he would be remembered was as a sacrifice in Sidious's plan to turn Anakin Skywalker to the dark side. After Anakin takes down Dooku, he has a mental crisis over his actions, something that probably should have been at least hinted at in the film to help portray the struggles he faced when falling to the dark side, and it wasn't a decision made in a single moment. Along with this, there are a few moments where he almost sees Palpatine for who and what he really is, but due to the situation's context, he rationalises things such as Palpatine asking for him to abandon Obi-Wan simply being the perspective of his lack of experience in such a situation, and his bravery holding its basis in his strength of convictions. And before this, there is an expanded exploration of Anakin's reaction to Palpatine briefly referencing his actions on Tatooine in Attack of the Clones, where it actually feels like something traumatic for the character, instead of just the source of one of the many prequel memes, or simply a poorly structured sequence in Attack of the Clones. One sequence that seems to fill in another potential inconsistency with the film in isolation is one on where the future Imperial officer Captain Needa from the original trilogy requests Grievous to surrender, which leads to both discovering that Palpatine had been rescued, thinking that Obi-Wan and Anakin had fully succeeded and escaped the ship, or that they were at least close to doing so, which gives more of a reason why a Venator Star Destroyer was attacking the one enemy ship that needed to remain intact at point-blank range during the film. In a sequence that describes how Obi-Wan views and uses the Force, he uses a more unique way of escaping from Grievous than in the film, which also demonstrates the point of the Force's inherent superiority over any mechanical attempts to compensate for it, as when Grievous moves to swing at him, he uses the Force to disengage part of the cybernetics in General Grievous's hand, which in turn forces the hand to spring open, and for the lightsaber to be dropped directly into Obi-Wan's hands. A trick that Obi-Wan later attempts against Anakin in their final duel on Mustafar. The end of the first part, or act of the novel, covers the scene of Anakin landing the cruiser and makes it clear that, instead of just being a vaguely difficult feat most Jedi could accomplish, the feat was otherwise impossible unless the Force itself willed it, or, failing that, for Anakin's own willpower and determination to overpower the will of the Force itself, which links to and displays both the idea of the Chosen One and Anakin's own attitudes and mindset towards the Force, with the novel even phrasing it as being no contest if it were a case of his own will versus the Force. After the Battle of Coruscant ends, Mace Windu's introduction is presented through his signature ability, Shatterpoint, to demonstrate the true extent of the situation by the time of the film. Although I have not read Stover's other main Star Wars novel, Shatterpoint, I think the sequence describing how Windu sees the galaxy is conveyed well, and explores the unique way that he feels the fate of the galaxy resting on his shoulders, since he can not only receive visions of how the future may play out, like many of the Jedi, but he is also able to interpret who or what are the most likely to change its course. with other stories, such as the Republic comics, stating that he foresaw at Geonosis that Dooku was the centre of the Clone Wars in that way, only for the Shatterpoint in question to rapidly vanish early into the conflict, which in itself demonstrates how directly tied to Sidious each side became. Which is also directly shown in both the film and novelisation, as Sidious has a continuous lines of beings on the Separatist side to manipulate until he reaches a position to end the Clone Wars, from Dooku to Grievous, and then finally to Newt Gunray. Thus, it is likely that, upon seeing that Anakin had become the Shatterpoint upon which balanced the entire fate of the galaxy, he would be determined not to miss the opportunity to use the Shatterpoint to find a way to end the Clone Wars, yet becoming so focused on seeing how Anakin would become Palpatine's Shatterpoint that he would eventually fail to see the need to track Skywalker's own Shatterpoint during his duel against Palpatine. Getting back to this chapter specifically, there are small pieces of world building that feel absent from the film. Mainly that the main reason the Jedi didn't already suspect Palpatine himself was because of the sheer amount of control he had already had as a result of the Clone Wars. A detail which itself could or should have been emphasised more to show that the Galactic Empire did not spontaneously form once Palpatine made his speech in Revenge of the Sith, and how severely the conflict had impacted Coruscant, with the latter being something that could have been incorporated into the film through something as basic as adding additional details to the CGI wide shots of Coruscant, at least in the earlier scenes of the film, to show the damage that the battle had caused to the planet. Later, in one of the main Yoda, Obi-Wan and Mace Windu sequences, the novel uses Obi-Wan's time in the wider galaxy and Outer Rim sieges as a way to catch the reader up on information regarding the ongoing hunt for Sidious. And in this scene, it is also brought up by Windu that the Chosen One prophecy and balancing the Force was stated that not even the greatest and wisest Jedi Masters in the era did not know what it meant or how to achieve it in detail, which is something that I like, as even though at this point I agree with the fan consensus that it is the absence of the dark side to achieve balance in the Force, or at least the chaotic element of it that is frequently embodied by the Sith, it absolutely makes sense for characters in-universe not to know what such concept means, since understanding the Force to such a degree would be like trying to understand or explore the entirety of not just a single galaxy, but all of the universe. Something impossible for a human mind to comprehend, and impossible to do within a human lifetime. The novel's depiction of Anakin and Padme's relationship simply shows just how bad it was. Not from a writing perspective, but from an in-universe one. Although, given some of Lucas's other writing decisions in the prequels, it is hard to tell if he intended for it to be portrayed this way or not. However, I do still dislike how the prose about Padme by the time of Revenge of the Sith referred to all of her major achievements as being secondary to the fact that she was Anakin Skywalker's wife, with the only interpretation to prevent this as being viewed as diminishing her character is the fact that it is her thought process while kissing Anakin, so it's possible that it was just from the rush of emotions from her reunion with him. Although it doesn't prevent elements such as her comparison of Anakin to a loyal tiger from being weird in universe and mocking of the romance out of universe. Although at least, unlike Anakin, she sometimes remains level-headed through the relationship, such as thinking through the context of his visions and nightmares logically to try and reassure him, or believing that they should put their duty ahead of their relationship given how significant both are within the galaxy, especially with Anakin's reputation in the Clone Wars as the hero with no fear. Meanwhile, with Anakin, even before he falls to the dark side, he has moments where he comes across as sinister, such as sensing her emotions and leading up to her telling him that she's pregnant, and jumping to the conclusion that it's the case that she was cheating on him. Prior to Anakin's appointment to the Jedi Council, there is another meeting between the Jedi Masters in order to decide how to proceed with Palpatine's manipulations and how to deal with the rest of the conflict. One of the in-universe reasons for the meeting is due to the Jedi's suspicions surrounding Palpatine, and by extension Anakin, as the way is that the Jedi Masters deployed themselves or attempts to draw out the Sith Lord by making them feel all overconfident, which was why Yoda moved to lead the clone forces on Kashyyyk at such a crucial moment of the Clone Wars, instead of presenting it as something that just happens at random for the sake of the plot. Which is definitely something that should have gotten some form of reference in the film, given what the stakes were for the Jedi Order and galactic civilization at the time, and how it was one of the core decisions that led to the downfall of both. As a result of the differences in format, the novel is also able to give several of the Jedi Council Masters the opportunity to voice their opinions on the matter, unlike the films where it's usually limited to Yoda, Mace Windu, and occasionally Ki-Adi-Mundi. Another example of Anakin Skywalker just appearing insane is the novelization's version of
"Take a seat,"
which makes his reaction in the film seem mild, and all it realistically would have done in universe would be to give the Jedi Masters yet another reason not only to deny him the promotion, but also Palpatine's request to add him to the Jedi Council in the first place, even without knowing that he only wanted it for selfish personal reasons. Along with it being almost complete confirmation that Skywalker was at least one step away from being on Palpatine's side entirely instead of the Jedi Orders, and that his next assignment would only make matters worse. To the point where he basically threatens the entire council and saying that it was an insult to both himself and Palpatine, and that would not go unpunished. Getting to the tragedy of Darth Plagueis the Wise, I feel the film version of the monologue and conversation flows better. Anakin at least actively asks more questions of the legend, which improves his characterization, and even if he isn't doing so in the right way, gives him a case of critical thinking, instead of just blindly absorbing what he is being told. Which leads to my favourite part of the scene, where he asks what happens to the Sith apprentice in the tragedy, to which Palpatine basically responds by saying that he's the best Sith to ever Sith, and with both reaching the conclusion that the tragedy actually has a happy ending for the Sith apprentice. Along with this, there are several points throughout the novel where Palpatine is just revelling in being the undercover Sith Lord and one step away from actively revealing himself. And Dooku likewise takes a similar approach in his opening taunts at the beginning of the film. As to be expected, the novel incorporates the deleted scenes regarding the future leaders of the Rebel Alliance. These sequences probably should have remained in the film, given how it was based around bringing everything full circle in the original saga. Along with this, the novel's depictions feel more complete than the films due to the combination of how the prose can expand on them, and how flatly he filmed the scenes themselves were directed. Another reason it arguably should have been kept in, at least in some form, is because it would have actually given Padme something to do in Revenge of the Sith, and potentially set up her and Anakin moving apart, as in the novel she realises that the Jedi she considers bringing into the group isn't Anakin, but instead Obi-Wan. Although not in the deleted scenes, the novel's version of these sequences concludes in the continuation of the declaration of the Galactic Empire, where Padme plans out how the rebel leaders would need to survive if before the Rebel Alliance itself could be formed. Although unfortunately the her main line from that sequence of "with thunderous applause" was changed ever so slightly and in my opinion for the worse. Although I like the novel's depiction of the Utapau battle, it's for reasons that are limited to the novel format, as it gives coverage to how it played into Sidious's wider plans, which I also read in the voice of HK-47 from KOTOR for some reason, which wouldn't really work in the film outside of general and probably a heavy-handed narration. Admittedly, this could have worked, but it may have felt weird and out of place at the time of release, given how there were several normal and basic film tropes that Lucas-era Star Wars simply didn't bother to use. To the point where the closest any Star Wars film prior to The Force Awakens got to even using flashbacks was the scene in this film where there were echoey Tusken Raider noises after Palpatine references them. However, I completely forgot just how long this chapter is. something that may have been done for the sake of closing it the same way it opens, while also needing to add both the Utapau sequences and Coruscant sequences from the film, while using the Jedi Trap prose who both open and close the chapter. When it reaches the point where Obi-Wan confronts Grievous, I prefer the film's depiction of how he deals with the Magna Guards by taking the path of least resistance to save most of his energy for dueling Grievous, similar to the ways that the Jedi act in the SWTOR cinematic trailers. Whereas in the novel, it's an extended sequence of him dealing with the base full of battle droids before taking on Grievous, and having the clones arrive before the duel starts, which my eyes simply glaze over when rereading the novel, given how inconsequential it seems. Although the following duel between Obi-Wan and Grievous does have redeeming qualities, such as showing how devastatingly fast Grievous's cybernetics can make him, with him being forced to strike 20 times a second before Obi-Wan's defences finally break. Despite having the subheading of Utapau, I feel that the best parts of this chapter are Palpatine's final manipulations of Anakin, using over-the-top hypothetical scenarios and processes to mask his manipulations, or alternatively simply phrasing them in from the perspective of being a galactic leader determined to end a conflict and presenting himself as more rational than the Jedi Order. Since it's at its peak in this chapter, I'm unsure if the plot point of Anakin simply refusing to sleep after the vision of Padme and using the Force to simply will himself to brute force through the fatigue was something that the author created specifically for the novel, or if it was a detail from a version of the film's script that got used as the basis for it. But if it was the latter, then I feel that there should have been more done to emphasise this point in the film. Even if it was as something as basic as having the character's appearance becoming more unkempt and half-exhausted as the film progressed, and having makeup up to portray the physical impact as it would have on his face. In earlier chapters, Palpatine also poses a scenario to Anakin, stating that if the Sith Lord manipulating the Clone Wars were to walk up to him, then he would simply open up a debate to see if he could find a way to end the galaxy-spanning conflict in order to present himself as more rational, as a counter to the Jedi and their black and white perspective on situations between them and the Sith. The duel between Palpatine and the Jedi Masters is portrayed much better in the novel than in the film, especially in regards to how Palpatine himself approaches it and manipulates it to his advantage. Highlighted in the initial chapter of the duel, rather than his later declaration of the Galactic Empire, Palpatine constructs the situation to make Windu and the other Jedi the aggressors by initially pretending to be the reasonable one in the confrontation, until he gets enough to make his lies and plot more convincing. Specifically, part of the chapter is presented as a partial account of the event that Palpatine presented while declaring the Galactic Empire, before moving back to the present point of the film to show how it actually played out. Along with this, Windu's bluntness only further plays into Palpatine's plan as, although from Windu's perspective the confrontation was as black and white as one of the countless ancient confrontations between powerful Sith Lords and Jedi Masters, to outside observers, Windu would seem like a mad Jedi willing to betray his own allies for the sake of enforcing Jedi rule over the galaxy. Not only does this interpretation of the scene do more to build on Palpatine's manipulative nature, the ways as I have imagined the novel's version playing out would, or at least could, have been more interesting uses of his Force abilities than what we got in the film. Once the chapter turns into a direct duel between Windu and Sidious, the duel is so intense that both combatants' movements are described as being comparable to moving in and out of existence. Yet it is framed in such a way that, if you do not like Jedi, Sith and the Force being presented in this way, you don't need to accept it as canonical as it is framed from Anakin's POV, while, as mentioned earlier, his mental state is negatively impacted, which could naturally be argued to give him an exaggerated interpretation of events. Chapter 19 is mainly bad and definitely the weakest in the novel. On Mustafar, Vader constantly makes puns as he makes his way through the Separatists, which makes it even weirder that it's after Mustafar in the film where he cries about his actions instead of on the way to the planet after his initial fall, and making the mission to Mustafar what renews his commitment to Sidious and the dark side. I know that both in the original trilogy and in Rogue One, Vader does make similar jokes. If the novel wanted to lean into this being where Anakin starts fully embracing the dark side, perhaps it should have removed most of the jokes and described him as finding a twisted sense of enjoyment as he goes through the event, and having him be overly aggressive or intimidating to his opponents. Meanwhile, unlike the film where it cuts to Obi-Wan and Yoda at the end of their initial fight, or the deleted scene where a squad of clones pretend to be Jedi to fool them, Obi-Wan pretends to be a hunchback who can barely speak Galactic Basic in order to infiltrate the Jedi Temple while carrying Yoda. For some reason. I don't think it's ever stated in the novel why this was the plan he and Yoda chose, especially given how short the act lasts for. Also, once they're inside, Obi-Wan refers to the Jedi Battlemaster Sindralig by his nickname of the Troll, which sort of feels like an inappropriate time to use such a nickname. And then when Palpatine is making his speech, let's just say it's nowhere near the quality of the speeches and monologues in Andor. However, the best part of this chapter is the expanded version of Obi-Wan's discovery of Anakin's fall to the dark side, and naturally having a breakdown over the revelation, to the point where he believes that Maul should have slayed him on Naboo to prevent Anakin from ever having been trained by the Jedi Order. Although the actual end point is the same as the end of the film, followed by the final piece of prose about the concept of darkness, the part just before it is the part that sticks out in my mind the most about the ending. The aforementioned description of "this is how it feels to be Anakin Skywalker forever," which, like some but not all of Anakin's sequences, uses second-person perspective to convey to the reader just how extreme the changes made by his armour and the impact of his defeat were. As such, I highly recommend the book for that sequence alone. Although I'm not sure if it would have had the same impact on screen, I feel that something similar to this should have been attempted in the actual film by presenting the scene of Vader's awakening either entirely or partially from his POV, instead of just a single shot of him watching the faceplate of his helmet descend. Along with this, the novel specifies that the reconstruction took several days on Coruscant as an additional detail to passively convey how extensive it was. This is something that extends to other novels involving Vader, to the point where Dark Lord Rise of Darth Vader dedicates almost an entire chapter to describing all the flaws that Vader had discovered in his armour within just a few weeks, including the fact that his boots don't fit his artificial feet. I also feel that this extract, combined with the aforementioned chapter, are the best presentations of what Vader's life was really like that I have found in either continuity. This video was initially meant to be longer and more in-depth, but after attempting to get it released for the 19th anniversary last year to be meta with how the same amount of time out of universe and in the real world had passed as in the in-universe timeline between Revenge of the Sith and A New Hope, I missed my original deadline. Then this time around, I forgot to make time for another reread this year, so here we are. However, I hope that I still managed to get my point across, so that the novelisation demonstrates the potential that Revenge of the Sith had, and how close it was to being a genuinely great Star Wars film alongside the original trilogy. Also, as much as I appreciate and enjoy prequel memes, I feel that I would have been willing to lose out on some of them for the sake of incorporating the novel's versions of sequences.